Hi, this is John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news site, and also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. Welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire, where we try to encapsulate and then unpack the big Catholic news of the last couple of weeks. Coming to you this week, once again, from Rome, the eternal city, where it is a bit chilly, but the news scene remains hot. This is the Pope Francis era. There is no such thing as downtime anymore. Lots of things we could talk about over the last fortnight, but let's focus on three. First, we have an important changing of the guard at the Vatican. Second, we have spiraling civil protest around the world and a kind of striking juxtaposition in the way the church has responded to it. And finally, we have a couple of erstwhile Catholic giants that have been in the news the last couple of weeks, and in both cases for less than ideal reasons. As we do every week here on the show, I'm going to give you the headlines, and then I'm going to give you the context. Headlines are these. First, Pope Francis has made a very important personnel move at the Vatican by appointing the 62-year-old Cardinal of Manila in the Philippines, Luis Antonio Tagle, although everybody calls him Chito, that's his nickname in the Philippines, as the new prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. That is the Vatican's primary missionary department. Most people in Rome still refer to it by its old Latin name, Propaganda Fide, and it is an extremely important department, and therefore, who Pope Francis chooses to lead it has consequences. It is responsible for overseeing local churches in what we think of as missionary territories. These days, for the most part, that means Africa and Asia. So Tagle immediately becomes Pope Francis's point man in that part of the world. Secondly, Propaganda Fide is an important political and financial player here in Rome. It owns a series of properties, and to assist the church in the developing world, it has fairly deep pockets, which means Tagle is also important, at least potentially, in terms of the Pope's ongoing effort to clean up the Vatican's financial operation. The main significance of the appointment, I suppose, could be expressed in 2 points. One, it puts a strong Pope Francis supporter in an important Vatican position, and it therefore strengthens this Pope's hand in terms of his ability to pursue and implement his agenda, beginning here in Rome, because in the Vatican, job descriptions only take you so far. Cardinals end up doing a lot of things that aren't necessarily on their formal, on a flowchart any place. And so this puts another strong player who is of the Pope's mind and supportive of his agenda in a position to get things done here. Obviously, it also sets up Tagle to implement the Pope's vision in a couple of the most crucially important parts of the world in terms of the Church's future prospects. Africa is by far the zone of the Church's greatest growth and its greatest dynamism these days. So Tagle's ability to bring Francis's vision alive in the Church in Africa, obviously, will have consequences not simply for that continent, but for the whole world. The other point about the significance of all this, it solidifies Tagle's profile as a possible successor to Pope Francis, someone that people who are enthusiastic about this Pope's agenda and who would want it to continue may turn to whenever that future moment comes when a successor has to be selected. That is hardly a slam dunk, but it certainly puts Tagle in a position to get a serious look when that moment comes, and that alone undoubtedly makes it momentous. All right, second headline we have on the dock this week: a civil protest around the world, from Latin America, places such as Nicaragua and Venezuela, all the way to Hong Kong, and even in Europe, in France with the Yellow Vest movement and other places. Street uprising, civil protest are in some ways the story of the moment. What is striking when you compare all this is the way the church has responded. In Latin America, the bishops of Nicaragua and Venezuela have identified themselves largely with those protest movement, even lent safe harbor and refuge to protesters, and at times paid a price for it. In Nicaragua, for instance, just in the last 48 hours, we've seen a priest detained for his alleged sympathy to the protesters. The government of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has actually accused the bishops of being coup plotters. Yet in Hong Kong, neither the local church nor the Vatican has said very much, and in fact, some of the dissidents in Hong Kong, particularly those who are Catholic, have expressed frustration about that. That is undoubtedly because, unlike Latin America, there is a superpower in Hong Kong one has to think about. That is, of course, China. And the Vatican's reluctance to upset the apple cart with China, some critics would argue, has led it to essentially sit out the current round of pro-democracy protests. We'll talk more about that. Finally, lost giants, or erstwhile giants, I should say. Catholic theology lost a giant in the last week or so with the death of German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, the founder of political theology, who died at 91. Meanwhile, in the United States, the great lion of the golden era of American Catholicism, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, his beatification process has been delayed for reasons related to concerns about his potential role in clerical abuse cases when he was the Bishop of Albany, New York. So all of that is happening. All of that illustrates larger truths and trends in the Catholic Church. So please stick around now that you have the headlines, please stick around for the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, the context. Let us start with the appointment of Cardinal Luis Antonio Chito Tagle of Manila in the Philippines. Now, even before we come to Cardinal Tagle himself, it's worth saying that this appointment puts an exclamation point on what a lot of people had already described as a Filipino moment in the global church. The three largest Catholic churches in the world today by population are Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. However, if you look at dynamism, levels of faith and practice, the ongoing social footprint and importance of the Catholic Church, you can make a very strong case that the Philippines is the most important Catholic country in the world. At least belongs on any short list of the countries that matter for the 21st century. And one of the ways you can gauge the significance of the Filipinos in today's church is that they have, in effect, become the new Irish. In everywhere you go around the world these days, you will find strong, dynamic Filipino communities on the ground of expats. You will find Filipino missionary priests and sisters serving in local churches. That is certainly true of the United States, but it's true from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to right here in Italy. In fact, there are a lot of Italian parishes right now that if all the Filipinos were to go home, you could essentially turn out the lights because the party would be over. And this Filipino human capital in the church is extraordinarily important. And obviously, seeing their cardinal, their highest profile and best known prelate, end up playing this big role on the Roman stage is sort of another confirmation of the centrality of the Philippines and Filipinos to Catholic destinies in the early 21st century. Now, in terms of Tagle, his profile would be as a humble, simple man, very much cut in the cloth of Pope Francis. When he was a young bishop in the Philippines, he was famous for biking by himself when he would go out to cover mass assignments. When he was at the bishop's residence downtown, he would invite the beggars who would congregate in the square out front to come in and have lunch with him. He typically does not walk around in a lot of ecclesiastical finery. He always invites you to call him by his nickname. So in that sense, he was Francis before Francis almost. And in fact, many years ago, I dubbed him the Asian Pope Francis, and the nickname is kind of stuck. Beyond that, in terms of his politics and his theology, he would profile as a kind of center-left figure, very, very much in sync with Pope Francis. He is, in terms of his academic background, he is a church historian who at one stage was a member of the editorial committee for the multi-volume History of Vatican II, produced by Italian scholars Giuseppe Alberigo and Alberto Malone. It's part of the Bologna school associated with the late Cardinal Giuseppe Leccaro, and definitely would put Tagle in that kind of broad reforming spirit of Vatican II camp. Again, very analogous to Pope Francis's own outlook. So his appointment will be good news broadly for people who are Pope Francis enthusiasts and who want to see the Pope surrounded by men who share his vision and determined to effect it. Major challenges that will await Tagle, aside from the broad task of trying to translate the Franciscan vision into operational terms in churches with very different social and political contexts in Africa and in Asia, two things stand out. One, he will now be responsible for overseeing Pope Francis's new anti-clerical sexual abuse guidelines in Africa and Asia. Most observers there would say that churches on those continents in general tend to be fairly behind the curve, and in some ways are still waiting for the bomb to go off before they defuse it. It will be interesting to see how much success Tagle has in sort of cajoling a more aggressive response. The other has to do with financial reform. It is widely taken for granted among Vatican observers today that the financial cleanup operation in the Vatican that was launched with great promise by Pope Francis in 2013-2014 has, for a variety of reasons, stalled. Recently, the Pope had to appoint new leadership for a couple of key financial positions. Early in 2020, the Vatican will be facing its next round of review from Moneyval. That's the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering agency. It is the gatekeeper, in effect, for the Vatican's admission to financial whitelists around the world. And at this stage, it would seem that the Vatican may be in for a mixed bag. Now that Tagle is in charge of one of the Vatican's important financial centers, and further, he will now have a seat at the table in the Vatican when decisions on these issues are made. He will undoubtedly face a challenge of trying to put some wind back into the sails of the Pope's financial reform. And the integrity of that form will also be measured to some extent by how he manages his own department. So, for a lot of reasons, the term of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle as the prefect of Propaganda Fide, which is supposed to begin in January, it shapes up as kind of must-see TV on the Vatican scene. All right, let's shift gears to civil protests around the world over the last year. Certainly, street protests, whether they are the climate change protests led by Greta Thunberg, the teenager who was just named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, or they are the protests against regimes that we have seen in parts of Latin America, particularly Nicaragua, Venezuela, whether they are broader social justice protests that we have seen with the Yellow Vest protests in France, or they are motivated, at least initially, by a specific piece of legislation and then grew into something bigger, as we have seen in the protests in Hong Kong. Civil protest, the theater of the street, has been an important narrative in global politics and global social life over the last year. Pope Francis, on his way back from his recent trip to Thailand and Japan, was asked about them. And he noted that this has become a global phenomenon. And he talked in particular about his own Latin America, describing it as a continent in many ways in flames today. Now, there is an interesting contrast to the general narrative of mounting social protests, sort of public impatience and distrust of systems, and the specific reaction the church has given in some of these contexts. In Nicaragua and Venezuela, local bishops have been very outspoken in favor of the protesters. And that has led to the church on occasion being targeted by the regimes in those places for various forms of harassment, persecution, verbal abuse, crackdowns, and so on. And while the Vatican itself has not been terribly outspoken, it certainly has made its support for those local bishops known, particularly at moments when the regimes, both in Venezuela and Nicaragua, seemed inclined to try to drive a wedge between the Pope and the local bishops, and the Vatican has always moved fairly aggressively to snuff those attempts out. So clearly, the Vatican has the back of Catholic leaders who, in turn, have the back of the protests. Now, in Hong Kong, on the other hand, it has been quite a different story. To date, the local hierarchy there, at least the hierarchy that is presently in charge, hasn't had much to say. Now, retired Cardinal Joseph Sin, former Bishop of Hong Kong, has been very outspokenly supportive of the protesters and critical of Beijing for being the force behind the crackdowns. But that really has not been heard from his successors. And the Vatican has been completely numb, I should say, although critics would accuse it of being numb. And to Pope Francis, on that trip to Thailand and Japan, actually dispatched telegrams to the leaders of China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong as he flew over their airspace. And what is striking is that while he referred to the country of China, he referred to the people and the territory of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and did not make any overt reference to the current cycle of protest. Obviously, most observers would attribute that to the fact that the Vatican currently is engaged in some high-stakes diplomacy with China. It last year signed a deal for the appointment of bishops, a deal that remains secret and remains controversial based on what we do know. And the ultimate end game here is a deal for full diplomatic relations between Beijing and the Holy See. Therefore, the Vatican is reluctant to do anything that might set back those negotiations or give China an excuse to pull the plug. Now, whether that justifies being silent in the face of what many would see as legitimate civil protest, demanding greater democracy, accountability, autonomy, and so on, that is in the eye of the beholder. Critics are frustrated that the Vatican has not said more, engaged itself more energetically. Defenders would tell you that the Vatican always has to engage in these kinds of balancing acts. And further, there's no a priori reason to believe that public support for the protesters from Rome would actually make things better for the protesters. If anything, it might sort of make the bullseye they're already carrying around in their backs more intense. Time will tell, but in any event for now, the Vatican appears content with the sound of silence with regard to the ongoing drama in Hong Kong. Finally, a quick word about a couple of lost giants, or erstwhile giants. First, we begin with German Father Johann Baptist Metz, who was one of the lions of the Second Vatican Council and just an absolute giant of German theology in the second half of the 20th century. He began teaching at the University of Munster in 1963 and remained there until his death in 1993. His signature contribution was what was called political theology. This was sort of a development of the insights of the Second Vatican Council, particularly the document Gaudium et Spes, the premise of which was both the joys and the hopes and the griefs of anxieties of the modern world must also be those of the Church. Metz's argument was that if the Church were going to take that seriously, that meant getting involved in politics. It meant trying to apply the message of the gospel in the hurly and burly of political choices. And his advocacy and his thought around those issues inspired countless thinkers and activists around the world. It played an important role in the emergence of liberation theology in Latin America. In fact, Brazilian Franciscan theologian Leonardo Boff was one of Metz's graduate students. And Metz was in turn a disciple of Karl Rahner, the famous German Jesuit thinker who inspired Vatican II. So if you like, you can draw a line from Rahner and Metz to Boff and to liberation theology in Latin America. Now, Metz, despite being such a titan and often enjoying such acclaim during the course of his life, nevertheless was himself a strikingly humble man with a lively sense of humor. I first spoke to him in the mid-90s when a group of friends in Germany organized a big sort of get-together for his 70th birthday. And they invited then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict, who had been kind of a theological rival of Metz in Germany. And in fact, when Ratzinger was the Archbishop of Munich, he vetoed Metz for an appointment to the theology faculty in Munich. So this was kind of an opportunity to let bygones be bygones. A lot of people thought it was a pretty moving gesture of reconciliation. That group, however, did not include the famed Swiss theologian Hans Küng, kind of the enfant terrible of Catholic theology in that era, who insisted it was inappropriate for Metz to appear in public with Ratzinger until Ratzinger delivered, a whole series of reforms in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the way the Vatican reacted to theological dissent, and so on. And what Metz told me when I called him at his home in Munster and asked him for his reaction to Küng, what he said was, I love Hans, but sometimes he acts like he's a rival magisterium, and one magisterium is more than enough for me. And it was that kind of just, ability to laugh at a set of circumstances and in many ways at himself that just made Metz such a remarkable guy. It's why he inspired such loyalty in his graduate students and in his friends. And it's why, whatever you think of the specifics of his theological work, he was a great Catholic soul, and he will be missed. Now, the other erstwhile giant who has been in the news lately is Fulton Sheen, of course, America's most famous Catholic evangelist, kind of the original TV priest who rose to such astonishing fame in the 50s and 60s. Now, Sheen, even though his fame is as a TV personality, a catechist, and evangelist, he was also a diocesan bishop. He was appointed an auxiliary bishop in the Diocese of Rochester, New York in 1959. And in 1966, he was made the diocesan bishop. That's a position he held until his retirement 3 years later in 1969. Now, what has been happening over the last few years is that a process for Sheen's beatification and eventual canonization as a Catholic saint has been making its way through the system. That process was led by the Diocese of Peoria in Illinois, which is where Sheen was born. Even though most of his life was in New York and his remains are at the moment in New York, there's a contest there actually as to where his remains ought to end up. But in any event, even though most of his adult life, and certainly the things for which we remember Fulton Sheen occurred largely in New York, it's Peoria that's been leading the diocese. They've been leading the diocesan cause. They concluded the diocesan phase, then the case went to Rome, and recently Pope Francis approved beatification, which is the last step before sainthood, and the beatification ceremony was set for this December. Within the last week, however, it has been announced that at the request of a few U.S. bishops, that beatification is going to be delayed. And in a statement to the media, the Diocese of Rochester in New York said that the delay was motivated by a desire to carefully, one more time, review Sheen's rule in a couple of cases of priests accused of clerical sexual abuse while he was the bishop. Now, to be clear, there is certainly no accusation of any misconduct against Sheen. But the question is whether he had any role at all in responding or not responding by the standards that the church today would regard as appropriate for a diocesan bishop. Now, we will have to wait to see what that next layer of review unearths. Certainly, the Diocese of Peoria has indicated that the cases that have been cited were already thoroughly examined as part of the beatification process. They at least are confident that no mishandling of abuse claims will be attributable to Fulton Sheen. But what we can say now with certainty about this development is that it suggests there is now a new standard for beatification and canonization in the Catholic Church, at least in our time, which is that in addition to the traditional requirements, that is, being shown to have led a life of heroic virtue, being shown to have been responsible for one miracle prior to beatification and another prior to canonization, all of those things. Anyone who is in leadership in the Catholic Church, meaning a bishop or religious superior largely, but also potentially even a layperson who had responsibility, managerial responsibility over others, they will have to be shown to have had clean hands on the clerical abuse scandals. That is, it will have to be shown that they were not responsible for ignoring, covering up, or mishandling, delaying a claim of sexual abuse against someone who was on the church's payroll. And that is certainly, and Sheen would be the test case, that is the standard going forward. You know, the hard but interesting question is how you might apply that standard going back. Because it may turn out that there were figures who have already been beatified and canonized, some of them towering figures in Catholic history, who have, in the end, can be shown to have had dubious records on one or more cases of clerical sexual abuse that fell under their authority. The obvious example would be St. John Paul II. There remain critical questions about the handling of the case of Mexican Father Marcial Maciel de Golado, the founder of the Legion of Christ, on John Paul's watch. More recently, there have also been critical questions about the role of John Paul and senior figures in his papacy in the case of ex-cardinal and now ex-priest Theodore McCarrick. Now, obviously, neither in the case of John Paul or anyone else, you might imagine, this new standard is not going to be applied retroactively. It's not as if anyone is going to lose their halo And there are very good reasons why applying today's standards automatically to figures from the past is probably anachronistic and unfair. But it does raise the question of whether certain halos in the future are going to come with an asterisk. Whether it will be a bit like the Baseball Hall of Fame and players who were around during the steroid era. Now, of course, there is no actual Hall of Fame for Catholic saints, but metaphorically, it's entirely possible that some of these saints could see their reputations, if not clouded, at least complicated by ex post facto, we have to say, judgments about their role in the clerical abuse scandals, which, of course, have been the towering shock to the system of the last really half century in Catholic life. All right, that's the context for the headlines that we looked at this week. You can find full coverage of all of these stories and much more on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. Do also continue to check out the website of the Word on Fire Institute for all of their great programming. It really is a tremendous resource. We will see you again soon. In the meantime, have a fantastic and blessed fortnight.